Professor Jiang Xueqin recently says America will lose the war with Iran. He's wrong, not because he miscalculates the missiles, but because he miscalculates the math of what winning actually means. Professor Jiang treats war as an all-or-nothing epic, a cinematic narrative of collapse. But geopolitics isn't a movie, it's a complex adaptive system, and systems don't collapse like dominoes, they compress toward their core. I call this strategic compression. When the cost of war hits the hard constraints of inflation and interest rates, great powers don't just shatter, they narrow their goals. They redefine victory to survive the stress. But here's the hidden assumption behind Professor Jiang's argument, and here is why his model fails the reality test. Professor Jiang's claim sounds dramatic, even convincing at first glance, but before debating whether the United States would win or lose, there is a more basic question that his analysis never properly addresses. What exactly counts as winning? Because when you examine Professor Jiang's argument closely, you discover that his entire conclusion rests on a hidden assumption. His model treats war as an all-or-nothing event. Either the United States completely defeats Iran and reshapes the region, or America loses and its global power collapses. That kind of narrative feels powerful because it resembles the structure of historical epics. But when we analyze wars as complex systems rather than cinematic stories, this assumption immediately breaks down. Professor Jiang is telling what I would call a cinematic narrative of collapse. In that narrative, once a great power steps into the wrong war, the system begins a domino sequence that ends with imperial downfall. But complex systems rarely collapse like dominoes. They compress toward their core objectives. This is what I call strategic compression. When pressure increases inside a system, whether that pressure comes from military cost, domestic politics, or economic constraints, the system does not immediately shatter. Instead, it narrows its goals, it sheds peripheral ambitions, and concentrates on protecting the core interest that matters most. In other words, the definition of victory changes as the constraints change. And once you recognize this dynamic, the question, can America win this war, becomes far less straightforward than Professor Jiang suggests. Because victory in modern geopolitics is rarely defined by the maximal objective that existed at the start of the conflict. It is defined by the objective that remains acceptable once the cost of the war becomes clear. In system terms, the reward function shifts. But we do not even need abstract theory to see this pattern. We only need to look at modern history. Consider the Korean War. When the war began in 1950, the maximal objective quickly expanded to include the possibility of unifying the entire peninsula under a pro-Western government. But once Chinese forces entered the conflict, the cost of pursuing that objective rose dramatically. At that point, the strategic system adjusted. The objective compressed. Instead of unifying Korea, the new goal became stabilizing the peninsula and preventing total communist domination. The war ended roughly where it began, along the 38th parallel. If you follow Professor Jiang's logic, this outcome would appear to be a defeat. The maximal objective was not achieved. But from the perspective of strategic equilibrium, the United States accomplished a far narrower but still meaningful goal, preserving the balance of power in Northeast Asia while avoiding a catastrophic escalation with China. The objective changed, and the system stabilized. The same pattern appears again in the Gulf War of 1991. The United States possessed overwhelming military superiority over Iraq. If war were about total destruction of the opponent, the logical outcome would have been to march directly to Baghdad and overthrow Saddam Hussein. But that was not the objective. The objective was limited: expel Iraqi forces from Kuwait and restore the regional balance. Once that goal was achieved, the war ended. Again, the maximal objective was deliberately abandoned. Strategic compression occurred because expanding the war carried costs and risks that exceeded the benefits. Now consider Afghanistan. Many commentators interpret the eventual U.S. withdrawal as proof that America lost the war entirely. But that interpretation ignores how the objectives of the conflict evolved over time. The initial objective after September 11th was to dismantle al-Qaeda's operational capacity and eliminate Afghanistan as a base for international terrorism. That objective was largely achieved within the early phase of the war. The later project of building a stable democratic state represented a much larger ambition that emerged afterward. As the years passed and the cost of maintaining a long-term occupation increased, the system again adjusted its objectives. The political reward of remaining in Afghanistan eventually became smaller than the cost of continuing the war. At that point, the rational move for the system was to exit the game. In strategic terms, this was not simply a collapse, it was a write-off. The system recognized that the reward function had changed, and it redeployed its resources elsewhere. This is precisely what Professor Jiang's model fails to capture. His analysis assumes that a great power must either achieve total victory or suffer total defeat. But in real-world geopolitical systems behave very differently. They continuously renegotiate what victory means. And this renegotiation is usually triggered not by battlefield events alone, but by deeper constraints inside the system itself. One of the most powerful constraints is economic. In a potential conflict with Iran, the true limiting factor may not be Iranian missiles or naval forces. The deeper constraint could be inflation. War in the Persian Gulf almost inevitably affects global oil prices. Rising oil prices feed directly into inflation across the global economy, and inflation creates pressure on central banks, especially the Federal Reserve, to keep interest rates high. When interest rates remain elevated, financial conditions tighten, debt becomes more expensive, asset markets become more fragile, and eventually political pressure emerges inside the domestic system. In other words, the constraint that reshapes the war may not come from Tehran at all. It may come from the interaction between oil prices, inflation, and monetary policy. When those pressures accumulate, the strategic system begins to compress its objectives. The goal of the war quietly shifts from ambitious transformation of the region to something narrower and more manageable, perhaps maintaining open shipping lanes, degrading specific military capabilities, or re-establishing deterrence. Once those limited goals are declared achieved, the system can exit the conflict while preserving internal stability. That is how complex political systems absorb shocks. They do not pursue maximal objectives indefinitely. They compress toward their core interests. And that is the biggest error in Professor Jiang's war analysis, because his definition of victory never changes. In his framework, winning requires total domination of the opponent. But in the real world, great powers almost never pursue war to that endpoint. Instead, they adjust the definition of success as constraints emerge. Wars rarely end with empires collapsing. They usually end with ambitions shrinking. The system absorbs pressure, redefines victory, and stabilizes around a new equilibrium. And once you understand that dynamic, Professor Jiang's argument stops looking like a rigorous prediction. It starts looking like a story based on the wrong model of how complex systems behave. Great powers do not survive by achieving every maximal objective. They survive by compressing their ambitions when the system demands it. And that is the biggest error in Professor Jiang's war analysis, because his definition of victory never changes.
In his framework, winning requires total domination of the opponent. But in the real world, great powers almost never pursue war to that endpoint. Instead, they adjust the definition of success as constraints emerge. Wars rarely end with empires collapsing. They usually end with ambitions shrinking. The system absorbs pressure, redefines victory, and stabilizes around a new equilibrium. And once you understand that dynamic, Professor Jiang's argument stops looking like a rigorous prediction. It starts looking like a story based on the wrong model of how complex systems behave. Great powers do not survive by achieving every maximal objective. They survive by compressing their ambitions when the system demands it. And that is the biggest error in Professor Jiang's war analysis. He misunderstands what winning actually means.